We're going to continue in our series called Revitalize. We've been in this series for quite some time. We started in the fall through the book of Ezra and Haggai, and in this new year, we've jumped into the book of Nehemiah. If you recall, this series is all about revitalizing the community that has been lost for the nation of Israel. It was lost because the people of Israel decided that obeying God's word was not necessarily a priority for them. They took upon themselves a whole host of other things that were more of a priority and decided that they were going to do things their way. And even though God sent prophet after prophet to warn them about the results and the consequences that would come their way, they nonetheless hardened their heart and decided to do what they wanted to do. And so the consequences came swiftly and severely. The people of Israel were conquered by the Babylonian king, King Nebuchadnezzar, who then exiled them in 3 different waves to Babylon. And they were there in exile for 70 years, according to the prophecy that God gave to Jeremiah. Once that time had come, and God had promised his people that he would restore them to the land, he raised up a number of people to lead the people from Babylon back to Jerusalem. But when they arrived in Jerusalem, they were heartbroken at what they saw. The walls were broken down. The temple had been destroyed. The city and the way of life that some of the older folks had come to love and cherish was no more. But God had commanded the people to rebuild their lives, to revitalize their community and their people. And so Ezra and Nehemiah is that story of how the people arrived back into the land and the ways in which they went about revitalizing their identity as God's people. And so we're picking it up in Nehemiah chapter 4. And we're going to see in Nehemiah chapter 4 where there's opposition that arises. Nehemiah is a great leader who is compelling and encouraging and modeling for the people how they need to go about doing the work that God has called them to do to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Because the walls of the city of Jerusalem served 2 purposes. One, it was to signify where the city was. That was God's city, the city of David. But also it served a secondary purpose, which is to provide safety and security for God's people, just as he promised. So long as the walls remained a heap of rubble and their gates burned, there's no security, there's no safety, and there's no definition to where the city is. And therefore the people are despised, and the name of God is dishonored. And so Nehemiah leads the rebuilding process, but it finds opposition everywhere they turn. In fact, the opposition is so severe in this chapter, we're going to see there's verbal intimidation, there's going to be threats of violence, on top of the other stuff that they have to do, namely to clear out the rubble, to rebuild the walls, and all the rest. They're overwhelmed. It's so much work to do. I was asked this question a couple weeks ago: how did you get through that? And it was because I was speaking at a winter retreat for another church, and I was talking about my last semester at Biola University and how I took 22 units that last semester. And I was playing collegiate baseball. And I was interning at a church. And I was dating my soon-to-be wife, Heather. And I just decided, let's do it all. Let's see what happens. And so it was because I changed my major and there were some other things that had to happen. So my life was crazy, absolutely crazy. And so when these folks asked the question, how did you get through that? They were asking for tips and tricks, and my answer was, barely. That's how I got through, barely. It was not without intense struggle. It was incredibly hard. It was incredibly hard because I had to learn to say no to social requests. Like some of my friends would be like, we'd go to Mocha Salsa on Beach Boulevard at about midnight, and you can get a carne asada burrito for $3.15. And we used to do that all the time. And so they would say, let's go get some Mocha Salsa. And I was like, I can't go, man. I got so much homework. And it was hard. It was hard to learn how to make time to read and to write and to do all the schoolwork and to do all the physical therapy and to do all the stuff because I got injured that semester. It was incredibly difficult, but it's a part of my story. It's a part of what God allowed me to go through and sent to me. And it was a time in which I learned a great deal about organization and a whole bunch of things what you shouldn't do. And I'm so grateful for it. But it was overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. How did I get through it? By the grace of God. I don't know how else. Lots of praying for energy and lots of planning and to making sure I didn't waste my days. And I'm not sure how that all happened, but it happened. And I think that's what's going on with the people as they experience the overwhelming work that lays ahead of them. How are they going to do it? How are they going to get through? And my answer is they're going to persevere by prayer and preparation. They're going to be able to endure the things that God has laid out for them to do and persevere even in the face of hostility and overwhelming to-do lists and tasks by simply praying and preparing. And in Nehemiah, what we're going to see is 3 different movements. In chapter 4, the sermon is going to follow just the basic outline of this chapter. There's going to be 3 different movements that happen in this chapter. Each one of the movements of chapter 4 is introduced by this idea that the adversaries or the enemies of God hear something. And so you're going to have chapter 4, verse 1, the enemies hear. Verse 7, the enemies hear. And then verse 15, the enemies hear. And then when they hear it, the course of action begins to take off. And so that's how the sermon is going to be structured. And so we're going to begin in that first section, verses 1 through 6, where the people of Judah and Jerusalem encounter verbal intimidation. We begin in verses 1 through 3. Now when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him and he said, "Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall." So what's happening here is the adversaries hear and they jeer. To jeer is to make fun of, to taunt, to mock. And if you notice the first movement we're talking about here in verse 1, Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, because all of chapter 3 is about the clans and the families coming together, and they're putting forth whatever effort and ability they have to rebuild the walls, and it's going on as intended. And so Sanballat hears of it, and he becomes angry and greatly enraged, and so he begins to jeer or taunt or make fun of the Jews that are there. This is God's adversaries. What is an adversary? An adversary is someone who resists or opposes. So sometimes an adversary can be a true enemy, and sometimes an adversary can be a friend, someone who opposes or resists you. And so these adversaries are opposing the work of God that God's people are called to do. But there's an escalation in their hostility. I want to point this out in chapter 2, verse 10. We're first introduced to these adversaries named Sanballat and Tobiah. And it says in chapter 2, verse 10, that they were displeased at the coming of somebody who is seeking their welfare, the welfare of the Jews. So they're displeased. They're upset. They're like, I don't like that. And then all of a sudden in verse 19 of chapter 2, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, they hear of what's going on, and they are jeering and despising the Jews. So it's gone from like displeasure, like, I don't really like that, to now all of a sudden, I despise that. Until we get to chapter 4, verse 1, where they are angry and greatly enraged. Do you see the escalation? And so that is what the people of God are facing right now, is that there are adversaries, those who hate them, those who are enraged, those who want them to stop, and they want what it is they're doing to be put to an end. And here's the reality in Nehemiah is wherever you look in Nehemiah, it seems like every time something good is happening, something bad is right around the corner. And I love the book because that reflects real life. You know, in mundane life, everyday life, I think there's a spiritual truth and a reality that even the good things that we do in life are always met in some way, shape, or form with something bad. I was thinking about that as I reflect on the Apostle Paul's travel plans in 1 Corinthians 16. He's writing to the church in Corinth about what he plans to do, and he says, I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. And so he's just talking about just travel plans, whatever. But there's a spiritual reality behind this. Look at what he says. He says, I'm going to stay here because a wide door for effective work has opened to me. In other words, there's a great work that has opened up for me to preach the gospel. I'm so excited for it. It's so good. And there are many adversaries. The English word "and" there is a translation from a Greek word which could also be translated as yet or but. So what Paul's saying is, I'm staying in Ephesus to continue to preach the gospel because it's so good. But there's adversaries. It seems like every time something good is happening, there's something evil, something bad right around the corner. And that's what we talked about last week, is that we have an adversary who is always seeking to undo the good things in life. And here's the reality, brothers and sisters. Our adversary, so the word Satan, S-A-T-A-N, that word Satan, it means adversary. We have an adversary who hates us because Satan hates what is good. If you have something good in your life, he's going to seek to destroy it. He hates what is good. And therefore, like we talked about last week in 1 Peter 5:8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, Satan, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And so, brothers and sisters, even the good things in life, vacations and spaghetti dinner, as good as those things can be, they can turn bad. Satan can use them for his own purposes to spoil the good thing that you're experiencing. He hates it. So anytime we do have good things in life, probably there's going to be a bad thing just around the corner. That's real life. That's how it is. One of the things that has helped me over the years is to remember this hymn that Martin Luther wrote in the 1500s. It's called "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." We don't necessarily sing it anymore because it's really hard to sing. And it's really wordy, and people don't like the words. And let me give you an example, because this stanza, for me, has been so encouraging over the years. Here's what we read. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God had willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fell him. I love that stanza. There is the prince of darkness. He is dangerous and not to be taken lightly, but we do not tremble in his presence. He can rage all he wants, but the reality is his downfall is already sure because he has fallen at one word, and that word is Jesus. And therefore, brothers and sisters, no matter what the adversary is and no matter what attacks come, we are insulated with Christ himself, so that the jeering and the opposition that we will inevitably face, because Satan hates good things and therefore he tries to arouse bad things in our lives, we can face them, for Christ is risen. With that in mind, we look in verse 2 and 3, where we see a series of questions that these adversaries, the opponents of what is good, are asking the Jews. And here's Sanballat, and I want to point this out. Verse 2, Sanballat is in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria. So he's got a whole army behind him. That can make somebody bold. You know what I mean? Tough guy Tuesday always happens when you got a big crowd behind you. And so here's Sanballat flexing his muscles because he's got an army behind him. And he asks these questions, and these questions are designed to attack the vulnerabilities and sensitivities of the Jews. Watch this. What are these feeble Jews doing? This first question is about the reality that the Jews are feeble. They're outnumbered. They're weak. They don't have the necessary resources to accomplish the task at hand. And so there's some truth to what the question is asking. What are you feeble Jews trying to do? There's some truth in that. We are feeble. We are weak. But it's really poking at their insecurities. The next question. Will they restore it for themselves? Is a question which is challenging their skill and ability. Can you actually do this? And then the question, will they sacrifice? What you do as a Jew is when you finish a building project, you offer a sacrifice to the Lord, giving him thanks for the opportunity and also for the ability to complete the project. So the question is, are you actually going to finish the work? Can you actually do it? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? And now we see, will they finish it up in a day? Like, you guys are all excited about building this project, but do you realistically understand the work that lays ahead of you? Are you really willing to put in all the effort? Are you really going to keep this pace up? You don't have what it takes. Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that? You guys have poor materials to work with. And you're going to build a wall out of all of this poor materials? You actually think you're going to be able to do this? You actually think you have what it takes to do what you're setting out to do? Really? Get a grip. You can't do it. And so each of these questions is an attack on the sensitivities and the vulnerabilities of the people. They know they're weak. They know they don't have the ability and skill because we saw a bunch of perfumers and merchants and goldsmiths who were trying to build the wall. They don't have a lot to work with. It's a bunch of burned stones. They know these things. And even though they know those things, these questions are really stinging words that attack the sensitivities. Brothers and sisters, we all have vulnerabilities and sensitivities, every single one of us. Some words that people say to us will hurt more than others because of where we're sensitive. Do you not think Satan knows that? Of course he does. And so he will put words into the mouths of friends and foe alike, and they will penetrate you and hurt you because they're aimed at your sensitivities and aimed at your vulnerabilities to shut you down and to shut you up. That's what he does. And then we jump into verse 3. I'm going to try not to laugh. I'm going to just say it, and then I'll laugh after I say it. All right, here we go. Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Now, the reason why this is funny to me is because I see Tobiah as the sidekick. And so you got Sanballat with the whole army, and he was like, yeah, and he's flexing his muscles. What are you going to do? And then Tobiah's back, and he's like, yeah, what he said. You're like, what a punk. But I love that. I just think this is so hilarious because he it's not original. So how is Nehemiah going to respond to these taunts? How is he going to respond to these jeers? How is Nehemiah going to reply to this intimidation of words? Nehemiah responds with an urgent and desperate prayer. Look at this in verse 4. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. You see, this whole movement began when the enemies of God, the adversaries of God, hear. And now what Nehemiah is saying is, God, hear. Hear that we are despised. Nehemiah runs to prayer. He is desperate. He is urgent. He's saying, God, please, would you hear what is happening to us? Which reminds us of what happened in Exodus chapter 3, where the people of Israel were enslaved in Egypt, and they cried out to God because of their suffering, and we read there that God heard and knew. Our God hears. Our God hears the cries of desperation. And so here, Nehemiah desperately is crying out to God to be heard, and then he goes on to say, turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. What Nehemiah is praying is for justice. You see, the nation of Israel was cast out of the land and were held captive for 70 years in Babylon because of their disobedience. And ultimately, their disobedience was because they did not obey God. And they despised God. And so if you look at the last little line of verse 5, they have provoked you to anger in the presence of the builders. You see, the nation of Israel provoked God to anger with their disobedience, and the result was they got booted out of their land and had to live for 70 years in Babylon. And so what Nehemiah is praying is, look, if we experienced the suffering of exile, living as captives in another land, then we're praying, God, that these people who are doing the same sin that we did, they get the same consequence. Not more, not less. They get the same justice. That's what he's praying for, that they would be justly treated because of their taunting, their jeering, and their ridicule. So, having prayed like this, asking God to hear, to bring justice swiftly, how will the people respond? Would they give in to the taunts? Would the words be proved too much? We read in verse 6, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, because the people had a mind to work. Even in the face of jeering and opposition and downright taunting, the people of Israel were not dissuaded from continuing the project of rebuilding. Instead, they were resilient. What does it mean to be resilient? Let me give you a word image. No, not a word image. Let me just give you an image that I will explain to you with words. I want you to imagine a soda can, and I want you to imagine a can of refried beans. And I stand up and I jump in the air and I land with both feet on top of each of those cans. What will happen to the soda can? It will be crushed. What will happen to the refried beans? They just stay there. I'll break my ankle. That's the difference between resiliency and when we give in. Resiliency is when we are the can of refried beans that no matter how much pressure falls on us, we maintain our composure and we maintain our posture. Whereas those who do not have the resiliency built in, the strength and the fortitude and the perseverance, when the pressure comes, they are crushed. And so what we see is the pressure has mounted for the people. The words have gone out and the taunts have been heard, and the people are not crushed like a soda can. They're strong like a can of refried beans. So brothers and sisters, be the beans. Be resilient. Be uncrushable. And I think one way in which the people became uncrushable is because they were praying. Because they were praying. And that praying caused them to be resilient, and that resiliency and perseverance enabled them to continue to do the good work that God had called them to. Now we go to movement number 2. We pick it up in verse 7. But. Shocking. As soon as something good happens in verse 6, something bad happens. But Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, that the breaches were beginning to be closed. They were very angry. Now, there's a whole bunch of people listed here, and you may not necessarily understand the importance of that, but let me break that down for you. Sanballat and Tobiah come from the north, which is Samaria. And then you have the Arabs listed, and they come from the south. And then you have the Ammonites, and they're going to come from the east. And then you have the Ashdodites, and they come from the west. So if you have adversaries from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the west, that means you're surrounded. That means nowhere you can go or turn that you will not face opposition and hostility and adversity. And their adversaries are very angry. So you can feel the pressure beginning to squeeze the Jews in Jerusalem. And then in verse 8 we read this, and all these angry adversaries plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. They are increasing the threat level. How? No longer words, but now we're threatened to come in with swords and spears, and we're going to fight against you. Physical threats. That is scary. And what's really scary about this is the Ashdodites and the Ammonites and the Arabs, they hated each other and they fought all the time. And now all of a sudden, they're allies. Because there's one truth and reality in the world we live in is community and relationship can be fostered very quickly. And you can feel connected with other people if you can identify a common enemy together. And so it's like, hey, let's get together. We hate these people, right? Yeah, all right, yeah, we're together. And that happens all the time, where people come together with a common enemy, and they're like, yes. And that's what's happening here. Now they're threatening physical violence. And I imagine that these folks are probably freaked out. Now, physical threats are frightening. I am just going to admit that. We live in America, and I'm so grateful for it because, by and large, we don't get threatened physically because of what we believe and because we're Christians. By and large. There may be some of you that get challenged to a fist fight or whatever. But by and large, nobody's threatening to kill us. You see, that's not true in other countries. There are many countries on planet Earth where you will get killed for being a Christian. And so I'm grateful to live in America. And I think when you see something like verse 8 where people are being threatened by physical violence, some of us will read it and we're like, oh man, I hope they, just muster up the courage like they're supposed to. And we kind of cast judgment on them. Like, come on, don't give in, wuss. And I realize, you know what? More and more, I'm starting to question how I would respond. If someone put a gun to my head, I'm not sure how I would respond. Because I haven't been in that situation. I would like to think, I would say, pull the trigger. That's what I would hope. That's what I want you guys to think I would do. But in reality, I'm not sure. Because there's times in my life where I've been a straight up coward. I haven't opened my mouth when I should have for fear of what people would think of me. And if I'm a coward in that situation, where people might think badly of me, how in the world am I going to be courageous when a gun is to my head? I'm not sure. And I'm not sure about you all. It's easy for us in comfortable pews with air-conditioned buildings to be like, nah, I would tell them to pull the trigger. But many of us, if we're being honest, we don't even confess Christ when it's inconvenient, let alone when a gun is to our head. And so this is challenging because I want to just say this, physical threats are scary. Are you kidding me? I'm not trying to be no brave macho, but it's just scary. I'm going to cut your head off. No, don't do that. I like my head. But here's what Jesus does is he tells us if you're going to be a follower of mine, you have to recognize the inherent danger that you may be physically threatened and physically assaulted. And Jesus doesn't put it in the fine print. That's one thing I hate about the false preachers today, where they're like, come to Jesus, everything is going to be awesome. And then the fine print is like, and it will be hard. And you're like, don't look at that. But Jesus, what he does, that's his advertisement. That's the big words on the posters of being a Christian is this. He's talking to his disciples saying the world's going to hate you. He says, I've said these things to you to keep you from falling away. So that way you're not confused and you're not shocked and you're not surprised at how hard it is to follow Jesus. I'm telling you ahead of time, it ain't easy. They will, that is the adversaries of God's people, will put you out of the synagogues. That is, they will disassociate with you. They will cause relational friction. They will remove you from the community. Indeed, the hour is coming, he says, when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. And they will do these things because they have not known the Father nor me. But I have said these things to you that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told them to you. Jesus gives the cost right up front. If you're going to follow me and you're going to claim my name and you're going to say that you are one of my people, then you better be ready for the verbal threats, the physical threats. You better be ready for it all because it's coming. And we actually open up the book of Acts and we see it, and it's happening left and right and all over the place. And we meet in chapter 8 and 9 of Acts this man named Saul. Look at how he's described in chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. This Saul is still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. And he went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, that is Christians, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So not only that, brothers and sisters, but this man Saul was actually going door to door, knocking on doors, and when he found Christians, he dragged them out. That would make you pause the next time somebody knocks on your door. If you know that a man is out there breathing threats and murder for what you believe, and he's going door to door to get you, and he's got actual papers that validate his work, and he's going out in public in the synagogues, rounding up the Christians, that would make you question whether or not you wanted to go to synagogue next Sabbath. Is it worth it? And I say this just because I want you to feel a little bit of the implication of this. If the Niners play at 10 and you can't go to church because of that, how in the world are you going to endure when suffering and the threats of physical violence come? Do you see what I'm saying? You didn't like that, did you? You didn't clap for that one. But brothers and sisters, what I'm trying to say is we need to have a dose of reality that Jesus says this: he's sending us out as sheep in the midst of wolves. That doesn't seem safe. And so what are we supposed to do as sheep among wolves? We're to be wise as serpents. We're to be innocent as doves. You can't be foolhardy and act as if nothing's going on, as if there's no pressure, no opposition, no hostility. But you also can't be guilty. Well, since we're in the presence of a bunch of wolves, let's just become wolves ourselves. No. Remain sheep. Remain wise. Remain innocent. And he goes on to say, beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. So do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. So fear not, therefore. You are of more value than many sparrows. If the Lord takes care of sparrows and they do not fall to the ground apart from his will, and if you are far more valuable than birds, then God will take care of you and God will keep you in his will. Come what may. So, brothers and sisters, how do we eradicate the fear of man? Is by bringing in a fear of God. God is to be feared. God is to be respected. God is to be honored. Those who oppose our message and those who oppose the Christ who is the center of our message and those who oppose us as Christ's messengers, they will come. And they may be lurking behind every corner. But that does not mean we should stop doing the good work God has called us to. And you see what they're trying to do in verse 8? They're trying to cause confusion. And the reason why that's significant is because our God is not a God of confusion, but a God of peace. And so I want to say this, which I think might be helpful. Anytime you encounter confusion and chaos and anarchy and disorder, that is not from God. God is a God of order. God is a God not of confusion, but of peace. God is the one who orders our chaos. God is the one who brings peace in the midst of just craziness. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to cause confusion, which tells me Satan is involved in this. And God's people should not involve themselves in it at all. We should not be people who are agents of increasing chaos and increasing confusion. We need to be agents of clarity and order. And so, with these things, how is Nehemiah going to respond? How he's going to lead the people? Verse 9. And notice the pronouns here, they're plural. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. How does Nehemiah respond to these murderous threats? With prayer and preparation. Prayer and planning. The prayer is this, that he holds this corporate worship in the sense of they all prayed together publicly. And then the second thing he does is he sets a guard as a protection, which is he's planning. He is making preparation. And that's why I said, you've heard me say this for a few weeks now, prayer and preparation, they have to be together. We cannot be people who only pray and then do nothing. And we can't be people who are like, I got to do it. And we never even acknowledge God along the way. It's got to be both, brothers and sisters. Pray and prepare. And that's what Nehemiah does. But the question is, will it hold? Will the people hold? Or will the opposition prove too much? Verse 10 and 12, we find our answer. In Judah, it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall. Do you notice the people are starting to believe the accusations levied against them in verse 2? Maybe they're right. We don't have the strength. There is too much rubble. We can't do it by ourselves. We don't have what it takes. And the reality is, a lot of that's true. And so they're starting to fail. Their resiliency is starting to waver. There's starting to be cracks in their confidence. Verse 11, and our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. In other words, we're going to sneak attack them. They're not going to know what's going to hit them. And you and I know what this is like. It's anxious, inducing. Every once in a while, I'll have friends or whatever that'll be like, hey, bro, you have some time to chat? And I'm like, oh, no. Yeah, about what? And not knowing what you want to talk about or when you want to talk about or the level of urgency of that conversation is I don't know. I don't know if I want to talk. And you know how that is. And when you just don't know, you just feel anxious about it. Somebody's like, hey, I'm just going to drop by. I got some things I want to get off my chest. Oh, you do? I don't think I'm home. I'm not there. And so they're not telling them when they're coming. They're not telling them how they're coming. They're just saying, we're going to come when you least expect it, and we're going to kill you. What? That would create anxiety in me. I don't know about you, but I would be freaked out. And so that's what's happening. And then in verse 12, and at that time, the Jews who live near, that is, they're living near Jerusalem, not in it, so they're in the suburbs. They came from all directions, and they said to us 10 times, that's emphatic, you must return to us. In other words, you got to come home, you got to come home, you got to come home. The point is this, in the midst of this chaos and brokenness, in the midst of all of this threat and danger, the people are beginning to fold. They're beginning to give in. They're believing lies. They're beginning to realize they're not out of control and they don't know what to do, and there is confusion. And because their hearts are so set on being safe and comfortable, they're like, you know what? I don't think this rebuilding Jerusalem is worth it. It's dangerous. So let's just go back home where it's safe and comfy. And that's a problem. I remember reading this poem some years ago by W.B. Yeats. It's entitled The Second Coming. And he wrote this. He said, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. The anarchy is loosed upon the world. The best lack conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And he's talking about the need of Jesus to come back because the world is filled with chaos. The world is filled with anarchy because good people don't have the confidence to act, and bad people have all the energy to do what is bad. And so the question is, will the center hold? Or with like centripetal force, will what is in the center be thrown away like a merry-go-round? Will the people be thrown? Or will they hold to the center? Will they stay vigilant? And that's the question. Is it going to prove too much? It seems like it. The people are starting to see that the threats are too great. And so look at Nehemiah, verse 13. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall and open places, I stationed the people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. In other words, Nehemiah looks at the situation, takes inventory, and says, you know what? If I was in their shoes and I wanted to attack us, I would come this way. And probably that way. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to defend those areas. And in his wisdom and in his discernment, he was able to put people where they needed to be. He makes this plan to erect defensive forces to make sure that the attack can't be successful. And then he goes on in verse 14, and he says, and I looked and I arose and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. I love what Nehemiah does here is he's reminding the people that the threats are indeed great, but remember the Lord, for the Lord is greater still. And we need that because there are times where our hearts will feel as if the threats are so great, nothing can be done about it. But the reality is we must remember the Lord. The threats are great, but God is greater still. And so what we read in Deuteronomy 7 is so helpful because remember, Nehemiah is a word-saturated man. He knows his Bible. So he remembers this when the nation of Israel is coming out of Egypt, where God says through Moses to his people, if you say in your heart, oh, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispose of them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt. The great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, wonders, mighty hand, the outstretched arm, by which the Lord your God brought you out, so will the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. Moreover, the Lord your God will send hornets among them, until those who are left hide themselves from you are destroyed. You shall not be in dread of them. Why not? Because the Lord your God is in your midst, and he is a great and awesome God. Brothers and sisters, one of the things we need, and I said this last week, is we need these stories of success in one another's lives. Because you and I are inundated with oppression in the sense that the anxiety is just wearing us down and the threats are overwhelming us. And so in the midst of that, we don't need to remember all of the greatness of the threats. We need to remember the greatness of God. And so what we do is we tell stories of God's mercy, and we tell stories of God's grace, and we tell stories of God's victory in our lives and how we've been delivered and the way in which God has proved himself faithful. For indeed, our God is great and awesome. And so we need to help each other remember that. But the reality is, brothers and sisters, what causes us a lot of times to forget the goodness, the greatness, and the awesomeness of God is our hearts are more concerned with safety and comfort than the things of the Lord. And I'm going to show you this from Hebrews 13. Here's what the writer writes. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Well, why? Well, because God said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So, if you believe that God will never leave you nor forsake you, you will be confident and you can say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Now let me make the connection for you. Those who utter the words, what can man do to me, speak confidently because they believe God when he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. But the only way that we are confident to say, what can you do to me? God is for me, is if we do not allow the idol of safety and comfort to take over our hearts. Instead, we must be content with whatever the Lord has given to us. Let me put it negatively. If you love money, and if you love comfort and safety, God's promise of never leaving you nor forsaking you will not mean very much. And you will very much be deathly afraid of what man can do to you. Because when you are boldly and confidently sure that God is for you and not against you, then no matter what comes your way, you realize God is in this. He's my helper. He will fight for me. I don't have to worry about anything. But if all you care about is comfort and safety, you're going to end up like the people who are saying, look, it's really dangerous out there. It's really unsafe. How about we just come home? How about we get away from all the danger? Who wants to be unsafe? Come home. But instead, Nehemiah is saying, no. We're not talking about going home. We're going to stay and fight. Because God is with us. And God is great. And God is awesome. And then we get to our third movement. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. Isn't that like God? Oh, you want to rise up against my people? Not so fast. Because our God, according to Psalm 33, is the God who brings the counsel of the nations to nothing, and he frustrates the plans of the peoples. Why? Because the counsel of the Lord stands forever, and the plans of his heart to all generations. If you're going to have your plans and you're going to have God's plans, it ain't 50-50. I'll tell you what, God's plans are going to win out every time. And if need be, he will frustrate our plans in order to get his plans to go. And they learned that lesson. And so each of the people returned to the work that God had called them to do. And then what Nehemiah does in verses 16 to 21 is he shows us this twofold approach to doing the work, which is pretty amazing. He says from that day on, like there's a respite, and there's not people attacking them. From that day on, he says, half of my servants worked on construction, and half held their spears, shields, bows, and coats of armor, or mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building on the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside me, and I said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, the work is great, and is widely spread, and we are separated on the wall, far from one another. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. You see, what Nehemiah does is he prepares the people to continue to do the work by doing this twofold approach. Half will work and half will prepare for battle. Those who are carrying the burdens, that is those who are the laborers who are carrying the supplies from one place to the next, they will carry with one hand, but they will have their weapon in the other. And those who are building will have their sword strapped to their side, and they'll keep doing the work on the wall from the sun up to the sun down. They get to work. This is the text that inspired Charles Spurgeon to come up with his magazine in 1865 called Sword and the Trowel. Sword and the Trowel has been in publication since 1865. And the magazine was an effort by Spurgeon to encourage his church to continue the twofold approach to gospel ministry. In the one hand, we build the church. In the other hand, we defend the truth of the gospel against attacks that seek to undermine it and invalidate it. So you're building and you're defending. And that's what Nehemiah does. Build the wall on one hand and defend on the other. And if we take this as a metaphor for today, what we could say is this: brothers and sisters, what God has called us to is to be actively building the church in the proclamation of the gospel on one hand, and recognizing that every good thing like that is probably going to be threatened by a bad thing, namely all kinds of ideology and ways of thinking and attacks and hostility, which must be defended against. So we must have a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. We must have a willingness to work to build the kingdom and also defend the truths of the gospel. They need to be together. And some people will only want to do one or the other. And I would say we got to do both. Nehemiah, what he does is show us that if we will work, God will work. And what do I mean by that? I want you to see in verses 14 and verse 20, where Nehemiah says to the people, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. And then he says, fight for your brothers, sons, daughters, wives, and homes. Fight. And then in verse 20, when you hear that trumpet sound, rally to us there, and God will fight for us. So who does the fighting? You've heard me say this 1,000 times. Do we fight or does God fight? And the answer is yes. Because as we labor, God works. And therefore, as they fight and as they work, God is at work. God is fighting. Nehemiah sees all of this, and he proves himself to be a prudent leader. And what I mean by prudent is he's able to look into the future and to kind of understand how things are kind of like he's anticipating, well, wait a minute, if this leads to this and that leads to that, then yeah, it might end up being this thing. And so he's looking into the future, not like a storyteller or a fortune teller, but he's looking like, man, this thing is leading to something. And so in verse 22 and 23, we see his prudence, where he prays and he plans and he does what is right. He says, I also said to the people at that time, verse 22, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I, nor my brothers, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. Nehemiah's like, wait a minute. These guys have kept coming at us time and time again. I don't think they're done yet. So prudently, he sees, you know what? I have a feeling they're going to come back. So why don't we set ourselves up in the present moment to prepare for that eventuality? Reminds me of Proverbs 22. The prudent sees danger and hides himself. In other words, the person who sees what's ahead of him, oh, this ain't going good. Like this is going to lead to this and lead to that. And what they do is they make present preparations for a future probability. Let me say that again. You make present decisions for a future probability. That's what wise people do. Fools, on the other hand, they just go on and suffer. They just go, oh, well, I don't care. Let's just keep on doing what we're doing, see what happens. And so I think prudence is important here, where Nehemiah is saying, look, I'm no fool. I see what's happening, and it's probably going to come back, so let's make the necessary preparations. Now, my question is, what does all this mean for us today? How does all this work together for us today? For me, I started to realize Jesus, his message, and increasingly his people are being more and more opposed. Some of us have experienced social or relational and at times even physical threats because of what we believe and who we stand for. I think some people, even in our congregation, may even say like, that's not that big a deal. It's not that big a deal. You know, there's really no opposition. It's not that big a deal. Come on. And I would say, okay, then at your next staff meeting at work, why don't you say that you believe God created human beings male and female? And that's it. See how that goes. Because the reality is, brothers and sisters, the seeds of the gospel are in the Garden of Eden. And if we're going to preach a gospel, we got to go back to the garden. And sometimes that's going to be uncomfortable for our culture. And we will face opposition. So how will you handle that? Will you cave in? In that moment, will you lack the resiliency to stand up for truth? In those kinds of moments, will you be crushed? How will you persevere? How do you face hostility and opposition and accusations and suffering and chaos and confusion and threats? And I think my answer is what Nehemiah would say: pray and prepare. How? I'm glad you asked. Ephesians 6. Now, this is the armor of God, and I do not have time to unpack it all. And I know you're frustrated by that. And you're like, Phil, I would love to hear your take on the belt of truth. I'm sure you would. Not today. But I want us to hear this and to try to bring together things we've heard from Nehemiah to prepare ourselves for the present day realities. And here's what the Apostle Paul writes. He says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. There is no greater power than that. And because of our faith in Jesus, we are united to Christ by faith. And so the Spirit that raised Christ from the dead dwells in us, and we have inherent power and strength from him, not self-generated. So be strong in the Lord. Be strong in his might. And put on the whole armor of God. Why? So that you will be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. If you think that Satan is not a schemer, you're fooling yourself. If you think that Satan doesn't have plans and doesn't have a way to get control of your life in some way, shape, or form, you're fooling yourself. The reality is we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heaven, in the heavenly places. There is a real war about us. And you may not be knowledgeable of it, and you may not be engaged in it, but it does not mean it's not happening. So what do? Well, the fact is we need to take up the whole armor of God, so that we'll be able to withstand in the evil day. And having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, verse 14. That's the resilient language. We're in a world that stands opposed to us and our message and the Christ whom we proclaim. The world hates us and is breathing murderous threats against us socially, perhaps one day physically. And the way in which we combat that is by putting on the whole armor of God, which begins with fastening around our waist the belt of truth. Because our world is filled with falsehoods, because Satan is the father of lies. And therefore we must be men and women of the truth. As 1 Corinthians 13 says, the great love chapter, love rejoices with the truth. They're not incompatible. And so instead of falsehood, we are men and women of truth. And we must put on the breastplate of righteousness. When the world tells us that good is bad and bad is good, we must put on the sure breastplate of righteousness that says what God says is good, and what God says is holy, and what is righteous in God's eyes is righteous. And we must put on shoes for our feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Because brothers and sisters, there's many of us who are cowardly in our willingness to share the gospel. Our feet are not ready to move and walk. We're not ready to proclaim the gospel because Satan has silenced us, and Satan has accused us and humiliated us. And instead, we need to prepare ourselves to get out there and preach the gospel of great peace and great joy. And in all circumstances, no matter what it is you face, we must take up the shield of faith, believing God and believing all that he has said, because by believing God and all that he has revealed to us in his word, we will be able to extinguish the flaming darts of the evil one who is always accusing us. God isn't as good as he says he is. God will not come through for you. God is withholding from you. God is a miser. And we can hold up that shield and say, no, he's not. Our God has promised us. Time and time again, he's promised us, and time again, I've seen him come through. I've heard it in this story, and that story, and this story, and that story. I've heard the brothers and sisters tell the story of the faithfulness of God. Our God is true. Our God is good. Our God is faithful. You're a liar. Get behind me, Satan. Verse 17, and we take on the helmet of salvation. Oh, Satan loves to accuse us that we're not really saved because we're not good people, and we answer back, well, of course we're not good people. That's why we need saving in the first place. We take up the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and we slay that evil dragon. We slay that dragon with words that are true. We slay that dragon which is dripping of the Spirit of God. We slay that ancient dragon and the adversary and the evil one and Satan himself. We slay him with the words of God, written by the Spirit, and also praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. So Paul says, to that end, keep alert with all perseverance. You see that? Keep alert. Persevere. How? Prayer. Brothers and sisters, we must prepare ourselves by putting on the full armor of God, but we must be a praying people. We can't be either one. We got to be both. What kind of prayers? Paul says, pray for all the saints, but also for me. Watch this. And pray that words may be given me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, a good thing of the gospel met with a bad thing of chains. But Paul wants to pray for more boldness because he says, I want to proclaim the gospel and declare it boldly, which is how I ought to speak. Not cowardly, but boldly. Brothers and sisters, I don't know what you're facing specifically. I have no clue. Some of you I do. I have a little black book in my pocket. When you tell me things, I write it down so I don't forget. I got your names in here and even phone numbers. So I know some of it, but I don't know a lot of it. But I can confidently tell you this day, you ain't gonna make it unless you pray and you prepare. But you know what? God gave us each other. And by God, we are going to pray. And we're going to prepare each other. And we're going to tell stories to each other. And we're going to celebrate the goodness of God. And we're going to see his mercy, and we're going to see his grace, and he's going to prove himself faithful. Brothers and sisters, you can persevere by prayer and preparation. Father, thank you. Oh, man, thank you, Lord. You have not left us without a witness. You have not left us languishing. You have not left us without a testimony of your faithfulness. You have not abandoned us to our own devices. You have not forsaken us to our own creativity. You have granted to us everything we need for life and godliness. In you, we have all that we need. But God, there's times we don't believe that. So when we don't believe that, God, help our faith. Strengthen it. Lord, there's times that this world will come against us, and we will feel the pressure. We will feel the need to cower. We will feel it. And Lord, we have felt it. God, would you give us resilience? God, would you give us perseverance? Would you give us courage and boldness? May we not be wolves among wolves, but may we be sheep among wolves, wise and innocent, but may we never forsake truth or compromise anything you've revealed. Come what may. So Lord, as we close this service, declaring your worth and your glory for all that you have done, meet us, I pray, and may we leave this place feeling strong in the Lord. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.